Joined now by Zach Cohen, writes about the NBA draft at RealGM, does betting content all over the place in addition to that, and he is going to be joining us periodically up until draft season. Break everything down, but we're going to start with the number one overall pick here because, of course, that's, I think, what's on everybody's mind, Zach, and I'll make it easy. Who do you think should be the number one overall pick this year?
You know, it's a really weird question because I do think that this year more than others, you kind of have to go based on fit. I think that there's a little bit more, uncertainty at the top of the draft where you can't just draft the best player available because, you're talking about the Hawks who have multiple guards on their team. And if it were me picking, with a blank slate, I'd probably go Nikola Topic, to be honest. That's kind of my number one in this draft. I think that his on-ball creation is just incredible. And I think that what we've seen from him, overseas, no matter where he's played, has been tremendous. But at the same time, yeah, you're talking about Atlanta. They can't take another on-ball player. They might look to trade DeJounte Murray or Trae Young this year. So I do think that, Alex Sarr is the name that we see everywhere. I think that makes a lot of sense. Just, a big forward that can really defend, has a lot of skills, both ends of the floor, honestly. But I also think that there's a slight chance, we're seeing it in reporting now, that Donovan Kleen does go number one. And I'll be honest, if you're asking me for a player in this draft that, I'm sure is going to be a really good NBA player, you're probably talking about Kleen, even though he's not number one on my board.
I think that's a great kind of encapsulation of how crazy this is all going to be. And the Atlanta side of it's interesting. I mean, I think people have probably pointed it out. I mean, the French connection literally there with Gobert and Snyder, and now maybe Sarr and Snyder. There is a little bit of a track record there in addition to the team need. But I went back and looked a little bit, right? Because this draft is getting compared to 2000, 2013, just these years where there was no obvious number one and a lack of talent overall. And obviously 2000, it's Kenyon Martin. 2013, it's Anthony Bennett. Could you give me who you think this year's Kenyon Martin and this year's Anthony Bennett would be? Because those are very different guys, right? One's a four-year player back in that era. One is a raw, toolsy, kind of exactly what the NBA thought it needed in 2013, which is like a stretch four who could play defense. You don't have to give me one, but in those molds, if we're kind of looking at the different ways this could go, Zach, who jumps to mind as an example of the experienced guy, an example of the raw guy that teams could fall in love with through this process and that the Hawks might take?
I mean, I guess if you're looking for a player that's kind of off the board, not off the board, just would be a little surprising at number one, but kind of has, the tools of a number one pick, I guess I'll go with Cody Williams, just because I do think that that's a guy that's, 6'8", really long, really good on the defensive end, but also offensively just has everything you're really looking for in a wing. Just has the ability to shoot, obviously a small sample size, but shot the three-point ball really well last year. Really does remind me of his brother. It's like a really easy comparison to make, but Jalen Williams is a really good NBA player. There are a lot of similarities in his game, and if you kind of look at the way they develop, there's a way you could look at yourself and talk yourself into Cody being a top 3 pick in this draft. And I do think that that would be the one that I think would be the most surprising, but it wouldn't shock me at all if the Hawks were just we think this guy has the most potential in this draft. We're going with Cody Williams.
Is there a pool of guys? You mentioned sort of like an off-the-board thing maybe with Cody Williams, but would you say that there's a pool of guys who are seriously being considered for the first 2 or 3 picks here? Is it sort of the same pool of guys that are being talked about there?
It seems like it. I mean, Jonathan Givony has kind of came out and said who the guys that Atlanta is considering, and it does seem like it's Sarr, it's Zachary Risauche, it's Donovan Kleen. I don't think that Nikola Topic was in there, but I remember there was a pool of 5 names that he was considering. But I do think that at most of the drafts you're going to see moving up until the actual draft, you're going to see Sarr, you're going to see Risauche as the top pick in this draft.
Why is Kleen considered just like a automatic top 10 lottery guy, and Zach Edey isn't? Because I look at both of those guys and I see giant humans with great touch in the paint and by the basket, rebounders, shot blocking, rim protection. I'm reading these scouting reports, and I got to be honest, Zach, I don't know that it's that big of a difference when I'm reading this stuff. And I watched, the March Madness, and I'm like, why is Kleen? I know he's better. He's that much better than Edey. Edey's the polarizing prospect, and everybody's got Kleen in the top 5.
I think with Kleen, he played in the UConn offense. It's a lot of read and react. Really good passer, just being able to read the floor. I think that with Edey, you're talking about a guy that's a little slower in the foot defensively and just was used to being fed the ball all game at the college level, playing against guys that were mostly smaller than him. I actually did write in my RealGM write-up for Edey. He played well against NBA size centers in college, but I just think that Edey was so used to a ball-dominant role on that Purdue team that there's really no way to really just try to project what he's going to look like as a small part of an NBA offense. I do think that he's going to be a guy that does a really good job giving you 15, 20 minutes off the bench. I just think his size kind of like warps the game a little bit. I think that some of his skills are very translatable, but I do think that the slow-footedness on the defensive end is kind of the big differentiator. I think that Kleen is, I don't know, I see all defensive potential with Kleen.
I like him. He was, you kind of mentioned it even before I asked you the Kenyon Martin question, Zach, but to me, he was the closest. I mean, we don't see four-year guys who break out scoring-wise in year 4 for a mid-major. Like, that track record with Kenyon Martin at Cincinnati, it's not really a one-to-one comp, but that's who I had in mind just because he has the one extra year. And then Cody Williams is exactly where I went for the more crazy option, the more outside the box, the more athletic kind of toolsy guy. But the other big archetype or like category here is all these international dudes, right? And I guess this sounds dumb in a way because of the era we're in, but I wonder what you think of if we're at a point where an international player can go number 1 and we just don't blink an eye. Obviously that happened last year, but that's a little different. Victor Wembanyama was a no-brainer, but we're watching a dude probably, get to the NBA Finals here in Luka Doncic, who should have gone number 1, did not go number 1, in large part because of some of this bias that we see. So the Hawks traditionally haven't really taken international players in recent years. Maybe Quinn Snyder changes that, like we said, but how much do you think that's still there of just the lack of info, the lack of familiarity, the fact that all these owners are just old dudes who don't pay attention to this stuff and they're going to trust, I watched that guy, like Wes was just saying. Well, we all watched Donovan Clingan. Take him. I know him. Do you think we're still there, or do you think all this success, all these MVP awards lately have turned a corner and we might see like Risa Shea or Topic or one of these dudes just surprise us and go number 1?
I think they're definitely more open-minded now. I think that they got to look to EuroLeague, like especially this year where you're talking about a pretty small, pool of players that are really at an elite level in the college game. So I think they're definitely more open to it. Hopefully this draft, like if it doesn't produce, an all-star at number 1, we don't look at it and say, oh, these international guys stink. Hopefully they just realize that this is just kind of a down year. But I do have, some small concerns with Sarr. I mean, I still understand like the case for him going number 1, but I do think he's a little further along from other potential number 1 picks we've seen in the last couple of years, just in that we're talking about a guy that like we compare him to Jaren Jackson Jr. That's kind of the most, used comp out there I think that I've seen for him. But offensively, Sarr just hasn't shown that much. I think that defensively, just an unbelievable prospect. I think he covers a lot of ground. He can guard, you can switch on the perimeter. He's fine. I think he's good inside, really good at deterring shots at the rim. But, like, his jumper's really far away, in my opinion. Shot like 28% from 3 last year. Free throw shooting got better throughout the course of the season, but I'm just not sure it's really easy to project what his offensive game is going to look like at the next level. So hopefully, like if he does, take some time, we're not looking next year and saying, oh, international guy busted in 2024.
Yeah, and to your point, it looks like the 5 or 6 of the top 10 or 11 guys are all not necessarily international, but you combine international with the G League Ignite and some of these other things like alternative programs, even Sarr spending time with OT Elite, right? Like you've got all these alternative paths that are feeding now the very top of the draft. And we're not necessarily new here, but this is to me, at least what I can remember, like it's 50% basically alt path and college kids. And to your point, it might not have to be the number 1 guy that fails, but if 4 of the 6 guys who get drafted from these alternative paths, whether it be the G League Ignite or international, people might also be able to use that as a criticism. But to your point, they shouldn't. And if anything, it's a criticism to how bad the college kids are.
Well, actually, to jump in here, because part of why I asked that question too isn't just this. Like this year, it's somewhat of an anomaly, just that there is so much uncertainty, and you could see it just being like pinned on these players, even though it's not their fault when they were born, But like in 2000, right? To keep using these couple of examples, Hedo Turkoglu becomes like the number one guy. You can go on Basketball Reference and sort drafts by win shares. He's number one from that draft. He went 16th. He was, I believe, the first international guy drafted that year. And then in 2013, obviously, that's the Giannis and Gobert draft. And so we've seen in even these awful drafts, international guys tend to be, when we look back, they're the guys that NBA teams underrated, that they weren't willing to take that risk on. I'm not, of course, there's probably not a Giannis in this draft. There might not even be a Gobert, or maybe not even a Turkoglu, but like that seems to kind of be the margin that you can win on if you're willing to take a risk on one of those guys. Now this year, that might be at 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 instead of like 15, 20, 30. But it's interesting to just think that if you can guess right on one of those guys, history tells us that's how you're going to get value in a bad draft. So is there, which you said Topic, tell us about him. What do you like about him? What could he do in the NBA, Zach?
I just think that Topic is a guy that, like, you could roll the ball out to him and kind of run your entire offense around him. I think that he's that good of just an on-ball engine. You know, he's a really, really good pick-and-roll player, just, like, getting downhill, attacking the rim. He's a really good finisher. He doesn't play above the rim, but finishes with both hands, just relentlessly attacks, kind of, you know, gets to the paint whenever he wants to. Can make every pass in the book. I know that there are concerns about his jump shot, but he shoots like 90% from the free throw line. I think that his form looks pretty nice. Like, he shoots a little bit of like a line drive, but I'm not really concerned about his jumper. The only thing I am concerned about with him a little bit is that he did get injured overseas playing for his second team this year. Jonathan Givony in his most recent thing did say that, like, you know, the NBA teams are worried about the way they treated that injury. Potentially might have needed surgery if he were, you know, in the States. So that's what I'm a little concerned about with him. But, like, I think if you're drafting for upside in this draft, that's about as good as you could do. Like, I think that he's a guy that could be a really special offensive player that raises the floor of an NBA team, you know, where an offensive efficiency for that team could be like top 15. I think he's that good.
So it sounds like that might be the most like translatable NBA skill in this draft from day one is maybe Topic's pick and roll ability, his ability to just sort of run an offense. Is that fair?
I think so. I mean, like, outside of like a Dalton Connect being a good shooter at the next level, like that, like there are things that translate just so easily. I think Klingen's defense is going to do the same, but I think Topic's ability to create for himself and his teammates is like probably the most translatable upside swing.
What would be also, like, what would be the biggest gamble? Like, if you just wanted to go crazy with the number one pick, and you're like, I want to find the next Giannis. I want to find like just the complete home run swing here. I have ultimate job security. If it doesn't work out, nobody's going to care. The owner's not going to call my office. Who would you go with?
I think that would still be Cody Williams. Like, I just think that he has the most tantalizing, you know, combination of size, tools, and skill. I just think that he has the most upside of anybody here. Another one, I guess you could say, is Ron Holland, who had a disappointing season in the G League. Really has a lot to do to figure out his shot, but at the same time, just a really explosive athlete, really good perimeter defender. Potentially an all defensive wing defender, which is obviously something that a lot of teams can use. But at the same time, the jumper is just such a nightmare right now that, like, there are concerns about whether or not he'll be able to play like in the playoffs when he does get to the NBA. So that's a guy that if you do somehow figure out the shot, if you're really confident in your shooting, like, coaches, like, maybe that's the swing you make. But I don't think I can get there with him as a top 5 pick.
Yeah, when we had I had Norris Cole on here talking about Buzelis and Holland a couple months ago. He raved about Holland as just a worker, and he was making the pitch. If you take that guy, he will exceed your expectations. He will overachieve. Of course, take that for what it's worth. That's a teammate, but that's also a teammate who's not going to BS. You know, what did he have to gain by lying about Ron Holland? So I thought that was an interesting data point, and him and Williams are, it's just betting on athleticism, and that's kind of why I had them both in that Anthony Bennett mold. But I think Williams, Wes, like you got to get used to this, Zach, if you're back on with us. Cody Williams went to my high school, as did J-Dub. So
here we go.
It's homerism. So, I just want to get my biases out of the way.
What was the mascot of your high school?
Early on here, a puma.
That makes sense. I don't know why.
Fully stolen from Penn State. They're the Panthers, right?
Same colors?
No, but the same exact icon, and then they just stole it.
That's what high schools do.
Yes, exactly.
My middle school was the Oakland Raiders. mascot. So
Yeah.
this is
Yeah,
going well.
our rival was taken from the Memphis Grizzlies, so that's just how this stuff goes. But on the topic of Williams, he leads me into my last question here, which is a lot of people talk about it in this way, but I think it's really helpful, which is when we're talking about the draft, looking at, because it's helpful that it happens around the same time, the final few teams in the NBA. What's working? What's winning? And what could we see teams value more because of that? I already teased that Williams feels like that to me. I mean, literally his brother made the Final 8. Jaden McDaniels feels like a very obvious comp there as well. But who else to you jumps out, Zach, as somebody where you're looking at the teams that have made it the furthest, guys that might be valued a little more highly in front offices as their wheels are spinning on, hey, if we want to beat that, what do we need?
I mean, I do think that Klingen's there. Like, everybody wants to clown on Rudy Gobert, like what he's done in these playoffs. But, the on-off numbers are really favorable for Gobert. Like, he's still a really valuable player for a winning team. I'm not getting sucked up in the memes of, like, him, like, not putting a hand up on Luka. Like, that's just not who I am. So I think that Klingen's ability to defend in the interior is, like, that's still really valuable. I think that the teams are going to want him. I think, like, Cody Williams, like, you look at the Celtics right now, like, I see him being pretty similar, like if he does pan out, to both Tatum and Jaylen Brown. I don't know, like Risa Shea, like in theory, is a winning basketball player. Like he's a 3-and-D wing that, like just really athletic, just gets up and down the floor in a hurry, really good in transition. I think that like maybe I am just not there with his jumper right now, and I think that he's a little weak. But I think that he can get there. Like the idea of Risa Shea is definitely something that you see in the playoffs right now, competing and helping a team win.
What about a guy like Reed Shepherd? Because I could see a lot of front offices being like, we need our Derek White. We need our Mike Conley. We need that. And they could look at Reed Shepherd.
Nemhard.
Yeah, or Nemhard, exactly.
I love Reed Shepherd, like especially if you have a big like ball handler. Like I think that Reed Shepherd can solve a lot of the problems with the Detroit Pistons. Like I know that's not a team that is one piece away, but like you stick him next to Cade, he guards the ones. Like then he's an off-ball shooter, one of the best shooters in this draft. Gives you a little secondary playmaking. I think if he ends up in the right situation, like he's going to be a stud.
I really like him. I'm starting to like him. I got a game for us before we sign off here. Is that all right?
Yeah.
All right, let's do it. It's really easy. I'm going to name players from last year's draft, and you stop me when they don't go number 1 in this draft. Okay?
All right.
Victor Wembanyama, obviously. Brandon Miller, obviously. Scoot Henderson, probably, right?
Yeah, I would. Okay. I had a higher evaluation on Scoot for sure.
Amen and Asar Thompson?
Yes, I think that they both would.
Anthony Black?
That's probably where it stops. I think that I wouldn't take Black 1 in this draft.
That's 5 guys. That's a lot. That is a lot.
Yeah.
I mean, even the year before, like
Derek Lively.
Shaedon Sharp probably goes number 1 in this draft, so now I'm getting to 7, Like Dyson Daniels, I guess, probably is where it ends there. You got Mathurin, Ivy, Murray, Jabari, Chet, Paolo. I think all those guys go number 1. It's kind of rough.
And I was super high on Dyson Daniels, so that's like I might have taken him more in this draft.
Wow. Great. All right.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, I wanted to circle back on, you mentioned like what would be the most out of the box, like trying to find the Giannis in this draft. I think we should just kind of call that the Washington Wizards theorem or something. Like they feel to me like the team that is the most likely to try something like that. I mean, we were just going through last year, and next up would have been Bilal Coulibaly, who I don't even think people would have thought would go 7, but looked pretty decent in Summer League in the limited time he played before he got hurt. So I think that their willingness to take international guys, the fact that they're just in full tank reset, rebuild mode, that really feels like where this changes. I was just going to go back to the Hawks to close us out by just asking Zach, like, you can correct me on anything you disagree with the premise of here, but my kind of working theory is that they'll probably keep Trey and are more likely to trade DeJounte. We've already heard like DeAndre Hunter's available. I would imagine everything but Jalen Johnson is being, released into the market, and they'll see what they can get. Who do you think, just coming back to fit, just locks into place with a team that is kind of Trae Young, Jalen Johnson, and then this guy, whoever it's going to be? What do you like the best to kind of keep winning a little, hopefully, but also give them another young asset going forward?
I kind of hate to go with like a traditional center at number 1 right now, but I think that if you are keeping Trey, you just go Kleen and just kind of build off, having a guy behind Trey that can really anchor the defense, really shore things up there. I think he'd be a good pick and roll partner for Trey. I think that, Quinn Snyder coached Gobert. He can get the best out of Kleen. So I think that that's kind of where I've been going with it. When people ask me like who they should bet to go number 1, I always say like, how much say do you think Quinn Snyder has in the organization? Because he might see a Rudy Gobert like clone and just want him.
That's a great call, actually. Yeah. Is that what you would do if you were the Hawks with number 1?
I think so. Like, I think that if I'm keeping Trey for sure, and then I would take Kleen.
There you have it.
They've drafted pretty well, but it's such a weird thing with the Hawks, right? Like their whole front office is different now, and they really only have one pick under their belt, which was Buffton last year, who we didn't see. I mean, Jalen Johnson, Okongwu, Herter, DeAndre Hunter was like, I mean, all things considered, he didn't bust out. John Collins late in the first round. Trey, I mean, obviously they didn't take Luka, but Trey's been really good. I mean, they really, outside of like Cam Reddish, they've hit on most of their picks over time. Even AJ Griffin seemed like a pretty decent guy. He didn't play much this past year.
It's also dramatic.
But everything's changed now. Exactly.
Yeah,
that was my point, right? Yeah. It's like, so then how much credit do you even give them, and how much say does Quinn have? And ownership seems to always be meddling there. It's a very weird team to have number 1 in a bad draft. It feels like everything is on the table.
Yeah, they seem to have a front office, a lot of disconnect there.
Yeah, and all their front office is like former players now who don't have exactly a lot of experience under their belt. So I'm not saying they're not capable, but it's definitely unique. All right. Hoping to have Zach back on throughout draft season as we ramp up toward late June, when all this will be figured out once and for all. You can check his writing on the draft out over at RealGM. We'll throw his Twitter up on the screen for the YouTube audience. And that'll do it for today's episode of the Just Basketball Show. Catch us one more time later this week, Friday. We might have an NBA Finals hangover by then. We might already be done talking about it, tired of talking about it with all this extra time, but we'll have some content for you coming. Enjoy the hoops in the meantime, and we will catch you guys all then.